Welcome to the comprehensive crafting guide for Torchlight Infinite. Whether you're brand new to the game or an experienced crafter looking for some advanced tips, this will help give you the tools that you need to start improving your gear or continue min-maxing. I'm going to be going over all the crafting methods roughly as they're introduced while you progress through the story. Before we continue, a special thanks to XD for sponsoring this video. If you aren't familiar with Torchlight Infinite, you can follow my link in the description or pinned comment. There, you'll be able to download the game completely for free on Steam, Google Play, TapTap, and most other major platforms. And if you need a build to start out your Torchlight journey, then be sure to check out my Torchlight Infinite starter build recommendations. That video will be in the card and down in the description below. Today's video is going to cover all of the crafting systems currently in the game, including Enchanting, which allows you to select a single modifier for your item, Empowerment, which determines how much energy an item will grant for you to use in skill customization, Ember crafting, which you use to construct items from bases, and Corrosion, a method of crafting that modifies your items in powerful yet unpredictable ways. The early sections of the video will be aimed primarily at beginners, breaking down the basics of each system and giving you tips on what to do and what not to do, including a live demonstration at the end. The later section will be aimed at more advanced players, with crafting topics like modifier groupings, fossils, and advanced embers. Feel free to use the chapters to skip around and rewatch sections of the video for reference later. Before I can get into crafting systems themselves though, there's one other important aspect I need to cover first, and this is how do you get the stuff that you need to craft with? Materials drop throughout the world of Leptis. Some are more common and some are rarer. Some start dropping early on, and some come from endgame bosses. So first up, flame fuel. This takes the form of flame residue, flame dust, flame sand, and flame elementium. You'll encounter flame residue and dust quite early on, but as you progress you're going to start seeing flame sand, then finally at a much higher level flame elementium will begin to drop. The quantity of these drops depend on several factors, but in general if you want as many as you can get, run time marks with more modifiers and apply compasses liberally. I'll be showing each of the crafting materials on screen so you get an idea of what they look like, but if it's a bit confusing without context, don't worry, I'll explain in more detail later in the video. One other important point to mention. Several times in the video, I'm going to reference buying and selling, usually in reference to flame sand or flame elementium. This refers to using the game's trade house to either sell it to other players or buy it from other players. Now, people are free to set prices in whatever crafting materials they want. However, from my experiences in the closed beta tests, people tend to buy and sell things in flame sand for cheaper stuff and flame elementium for more expensive items. But flame fuel alone will not an item make. You'll also need embers, which begin dropping early in the endgame process. And as you continue to progress, again you'll find more embers, and the types of embers you can find will be rarer. Embers in combination with flame fuel are how you craft in Torchlight Infinite, but I'll get into more detail during the dedicated crafting section. And finally, there are several other currencies or currency-like items which can drop. The most relevant for today's discussion are energy cores used in refining. These will start dropping pretty early on, and fossils, which can be used to make some of the best items Leptis has to offer. As you start experimenting with crafting your own items, feel free to use flame dust and energy cores early on, but I'd consider being frugal with your flame sand until you reach endgame and unlock crafting. Instead, use your early flame sand to purchase a few helpful items from other players off the trade house, maybe a good legendary for your build, as this will help you progress your character much faster than trying to craft something too soon. And once you start getting flame elementium drops, I suggest doing the same. But don't worry, eventually once you start to grind, you'll have hundreds if not thousands of these. So they're not irreplaceable or anything like that. But how do you craft these amazing items, you might be saying? Well, I'm glad you asked. The first system you'll be introduced to is Enchanting. And Enchanting is normally the last step in your crafting project, because you can't use other crafting methods on enchanted items. You first get introduced to Enchanting around level 30, where you'll be prompted to add modifiers to an example item provided by the crafting tutor. The modifiers you can enchant on will vary a bit based on the item's type and level. It's pretty simple. You select the modifier you want, select the tier you want, and as long as you have the materials, you'll be able to add it. Because Enchanting requires an empty affix, it's ideal to enchant items with 5 affixes. And again, this will be the last step in your crafting process. One of the next crafting systems you'll be introduced to is Gear Empowerment. Energy allows you to add more supports to your main skills, and higher level items have a higher maximum energy. Empowerment allows you to use energy cores to randomly reroll the amount of energy offered by an item. You can really do this at any step in the process, but you'll want to do it before you corrode the item if you're going that far. Personally, I like to buy high energy bases and just craft on those instead, thus skipping most of this. and it should be noted that amulets, rings, and belts cannot normally be empowered. But you can empower all rarities of items, including legendaries. So don't feel too pressured to max everything out as soon as you get it, but in general, more supports on your skills are better, so you should get around to it eventually. Now, Torchlight Infinite's main crafting system is referred to in-game as crafting. I mean, I'm not really sure what you were expecting there. Item burning? Maybe 20 years ago, but we're talking about gear, not CDs. Most of the time, your ideal crafting project will be on an item level 85 base. For most of his projects, you'll want a base with a level 61 or higher requirement. Later in the endgame, you can obtain some higher level bases with special properties, but as a rule of thumb, both in terms of base and item level, higher is better. Items can have up to 3 prefixes and 3 suffixes for a total of 6 affixes. White items will have 0, blue items will have 2, 1 prefix, 1 suffix, purple will have up to 5, 2 to 3 prefixes, 2 to 3 suffixes, and finally, pink items will have 6 affixes, 3 prefixes, and 3 suffixes. Legendary items are orange and cannot be crafted by this system, therefore they do not follow these rules. When crafting, you use embers to add new modifiers to your items. The affixes which can be added depend on the item's base type and the embers that you use, in combination with the item level that acts as a gate or requirement. Certain rarer and more powerful modifiers or certain higher tier mods will only appear on level 80 or 85 items. Most embers only add or replace a specific affix type. So Vigor embers only affect your prefixes and can add life or mana modifiers. Tenacity embers only affect your suffixes and add resistance modifiers. Some embers can only be used on items that already have 4 or 6 mods. For most embers, after you apply an ember and pay the associated cost, you'll be able to choose whether you want to preserve the item's current state or choose the item's new state. So if you don't like the results of your crafting, you can always go back and try again. It should be noted that Ember of Truth works a little bit differently, but more about that in the advanced section. Now here's a chart of the costs to attempt to add a modifier to your item. The more modifiers that are on an item, the more expensive that it gets. This means if you only want to add 1 or 2 mods to a white item, it's going to be extremely cheap, and you can spend a lot of attempts before it will really cost you anything. But if you want to add anything to a 6 mod item, it's going to cost 20 flame elementium per attempt, which is going to be extremely expensive. So especially if you're going to be spending flame elementium to craft on an item, do make sure it's really worth it. It should be noted that 6 existing modifiers is a requirement of the Ominous and Restless Embers, which give legendary affixes that are incredibly powerful. Now, when applying an ember to an item, like I mentioned earlier, it can either add or replace a mod on the item. And here's a quick chart with the odds of it adding a modifier instead of replacing a modifier. Through trial and error testing, I guessed that it was roughly a 50% chance starting around 3-4 mods on the item, and XD was kind enough to confirm the official numbers for this. Though, if you did want to have a 100% chance to always add a mod, you could use an acute fossil, but more about that a little bit later. Now, a lot of the time, it feels as if a mod being replaced is just random chance, but there's actually 2 conditions under which it can happen. The first is the ember just fails to add something. The second, though, is it attempts to add something that already exists on an item. If the ember attempts to add a modifier which already exists on your item, it will attempt to replace it. Again, this is where acute fossils can become handy, since they prevent that behavior. Because of the increasing costs, you'll want to add rare modifiers at the earliest possible stage. So, for example, if you wanted to add the extremely rare and powerful Fervor suffix to your gloves, you'd need a pair of item level 85 gloves, and to start with, you'd want to have 4 initial modifiers on it. And from there, you'd want to spam a few hundred times to hopefully get what you want. Because you get a choice on whether or not you keep the original or the new version, there aren't really any true fail states, at least until you attempt Corrosion. However, that doesn't mean it won't be extremely expensive to get a rare modifier like Fervor. So how does applying an Ember work? Let's say that you're using a Vigor Ember on a Strength helmet. The first thing it will do is pick the mod group to be applied. The options here are Maximum Life, with a weighting of 11,700, regenerates life per second, again 11,700, regenerates percent life per second, a weighting of 1,200, and minion max life with 11,700. So roughly a 1 in 3 for max life, regenerates life per second, and minion max life, and a 1 in 33-ish for percentile regen. Let's just pretend that it picks maximum life. It'll then attempt to pick a tier within the mod, and you'll notice that tier 3, 70 to 80 max life, has a particularly high weighting at 23%, whereas tier 1 has a particularly low weighting at 2.56%. This means that if you're getting any specific outcome, you have roughly a 1 in 5 to get tier 3, and that's something pretty achievable to aim for. If you're lucky, you might even get tier 2 or tier 1, so if you're crafting on a level 85 base, you have roughly a 1 in 3 chance after a 1 in 3 or a 1 in 9 of getting what you want. But it would be much more difficult if you needed something like T1 life specifically, as that's significantly rarer. Some embers require a minimum number of modifiers on the item. Ruling and Technique embers can only be used on items with at least 4 modifiers, whereas the legendary Ominous and Restless embers can only be used on items with 6 modifiers. In general, the modifiers added by these embers are significantly more powerful than those added by other embers, but the costs associated with crafting also go up significantly. For example, just to use a single Ominous ember will cost you 20 Flame Elementium, but the results could be game-warpingly powerful for your build. Now, the last system I want to talk about is Corrosion. This is a crafting system tied to the Dark Surge seasonal content. Corrosion can be applied to items completely for free while you're leveling up. However, once you reach endgame, you'll need to spend Emberon cores, which are obtained from fighting enemies within the Dark Surge mechanic. Like with Empowerment, Corrosion can be applied to legendary items, and offers a variety of effects which are applied to your item at random. This means there are some very interesting outcomes, and it's not always going to be beneficial. The first result is Mutation, which adds a random Ember affix. This will replace the implicit modifier on your item. It will put the gear into a corroded state, and offer some really interesting results. For example, you can get an enemies you kill explode implicit on your weapon, or conversion implicits on your gloves. But if you're already playing a fire conversion build and you get lightning conversion on your gloves, that could brick your character, so do corrupt with caution. The next outcome is Chaos. It randomizes all values and puts the gear into a corroded state. Think of this as applies an Ember of Truth. Then there's Arrogance, which is by far the most interesting. Upgrades either a prefix or a suffix by 1 to 2 ranks. If that modifier surpasses tier 1, it will switch to a special corroded mod. And again, some of these are really interesting and powerful, and some could be detrimental depending on the item in the build. And then finally Void, which puts the gear into a corroded state and does nothing. Now, if you manage to collect some edicts, you also could unlock the Desecration option by fighting the boss Keegan. Darkest Corrosion adds the Desecration option, which works exactly like Arrogance, except it affects 2 modifiers on your items, and some of the results are honestly spectacular. But again, do this with caution since it's only a 15% chance, and it could make your item actively worse. Before I get into the advanced crafting section, I wanted to start with some basic crafting tips you might find helpful. First off, always do your enchanting last. This will help prevent you from wasting resources because you forgot that crafting or corroding an item removes enchantments. Similarly, item corrosion should only be done if you can afford to replace something, as not only does it apply a cost multiplier, so it'll be more difficult to modify further, but it can make the item worse in some cases. Adding a 5th or 6th mod can get very expensive, and while a majority of crafts cost flame sand, which is relatively common, higher tier enchantments and some later steps cost flame elementium. This means when you're trying to roll a rare modifier, you'll want to do it as early in the process as you can. If you just want to make an item with life and 3 resistances, for example, you'd want to roll the life first, since that ember has a lot more outcomes you don't want, and again, you'd want to aim for that tier 3 life mod, since that's generally the easiest to roll. Crafting this way can save you a lot of costs, since the Tenacity Ember will give you several resistance suffixes, all of which you could use. And especially early on, don't try to roll all tier 1 mods. This will get very expensive very quickly, and always remember to double check before accepting a new crafting state. There's currently no way to remove modifiers from items, and like I mentioned previously, replacing a mod on a finished item will cost a whopping 20 Flame Elementium, so do be careful about making that mistake. But as you're progressing through time marks, plenty of items with tier 3 or even tier 4 mods are more than sufficient. They'll take you all the way up to smoothly farming time mark 7, as long as you have a good build idea. So, since I just mentioned a ring with life and 3 resists, let's do a live crafting demo to demonstrate how you might make something like that. So to help you get a better idea of how crafting works, I'm now going to do a live crafting demo. I know this is a pre-recorded video, but the idea here is the crafting itself is not scripted, it's not edited, this is all going to be one cut. If I make a mistake, it's going to stay in. So you'll see how an item unfolds. The goal with this ring is going to be to make a decent starter item. So I want high life, I want hopefully a damage mod, and I want some resists. And I'm not going to worry about getting tier 1s, using fossils, or any advanced stuff. This is just how you would create a basic item on a budget. My budget being relatively moderate. I'm not going to constrain myself too much in terms of a flame dust, because you'll probably have a lot of it. However, I am going to limit myself to 50 flame sand and 5 flame elementium. Most likely the elementium won't be spent at all, but if there's some really good options, who knows? So to start with, you'll want to use Vigor Embers, since we want life, and there's a decent amount of life affixes. We'll start here. We'll do the cheapest, well, hardest to roll first. And of course, we hit mana, so gonna go back. 89 life. All right, I got really lucky on this, and this is both the upside and downside of an unscripted life crafting session. 89 life, I'll absolutely take. Next up, gonna go down to the Tenacity Ember, because resistances are good. And again, I want to be pickier here and get another higher tier resist. I'm just gonna say that there has to be fire res on the item. I know technically this is all theoretical, but I'm gonna pretend there has to be fire res, and erosion res would be nice. Don't want to take that one, it deleted the prefix. Fire res, but it's low tier, and again, we're costing flame sand, or wait, dust. Yeah, dust. Nope, don't want that. All right, 24% erosion resistance. This means it will be a little bit harder to get fire res, but it's a really good erosion resistance roll, so gonna take it. Now, continuing with the embers, this is where I'll want to hit fire specifically. 30%. Too bad it's deleting our really good life. Remember, the higher the odds, the more the affixes on the item, the higher the odds. That's a better way to put it. So cold res, if we're just after generic resists, this is really good. But as I said, fire res is a requirement and it'll be much harder to roll later. So unfortunately, I'm not going to take... Oh, this is a tough one. We need fire res. The erosion res is really good. I'm going to take the really good fire res. And again, now fire res will always roll over this because you can only have one affix of a given group. Hit lightning, that's acceptable. I'd really like erosion here, but this is the expensive one. So if I get another good resist, 40 cold, you know what? It's good enough. It could have been a mistake to go over the erosion res. We're doing this on a budget. And now, I did mention maybe we could spend a little flame elementium. Ideally, we wouldn't want to. We still have about 30 of these left to spend. Ideally, damage. You could use a ruling ember. Nothing really for damage here. Mana restored on hit could be good. Instead, I'm going to go up here. Amplified. If you're a melee build, ailment build, projectile build, spell build. If you're an attack build, this is the way to go. And again, you don't want to be too picky about the tiers. So we don't want this because it took away a suffix. Again, don't want to take away those suffixes. 39. All right, not super high tier. You can always check the tiers like this. I think this is overall a really solid item for the theoretical attack build. Now that I've explained the basics, what are some advanced ways in which you can craft to make items better or more easily? Before I get into that though, again, a quick thanks to XD for not only sponsoring, but helping out with this video. For now, what can you use to make some of the best items available within Leptis? Well, you can actually get pretty far without using any fossils at all, but if you're going to go all out, you're definitely going to want to use them. And there are currently 2 types of fossils in Torchlight Infinite. The first is the acute fossil. Acute fossils guarantee that the item will gain 1 affix during crafting. So at a basic level, you could use an acute fossil on an item with 5 mods to add a 6th mod without having to deal with a 40% success and 60% fail chance. At least assuming that failure in this case is it replacing the mod, you keeping the old version, and trying again. Another advantage though, would be if you want to roll a modifier without it rolling over something you already have from the same fossil. So if you have a Tenacity Ember, and you already have 2 suffixes on your item, let's say fire res and erosion res, and you want to add cold or lightning res, one great way to do that would be to use an acute fossil. But the second fossil is much more interesting, and that is the spiral fossil. The spiral fossil restricts outcomes to high level or tier 1 and 2 modifiers only. So if you're trying to roll a modifier that only has 1 or 2 tiers, this fossil will have no effect. But many modifiers have 3 tiers or more. Let's take life, for example. Normally, tier 1 and tier 2 modifiers have a significantly lower weighting than tier 3 or lower. However, if you use a spiral fossil, they'll become the only outcomes. So if you want to roll an item with exclusively high tier modifiers, you'll use vastly less attempts if you're able to include a spiral fossil with each one. Though do be aware, spiral fossils are likely to be quite expensive, so I wouldn't use them frivolously. Now, there are also two special embers which I haven't talked about in detail previously. These are the Reincarnation Ember and Truth Ember. The Reincarnation Ember rerolls the modifiers on an item. And you can somewhat think of this as generating a completely new item with new mods at random, though the new mods don't seem to ever be the same as the ones that already exist on the item that you're using it on. It's also important to mention that the Reincarnation Ember does not use the same mod pool as crafting. Instead, it pulls from the pool used by item drops. In general, what this means is there's going to be a lower level requirement to roll a modifier. So if you have a level 75 base, you might get vastly better results by using Reincarnation Embers on it rather than attempting to craft something. Personally, I've had a decent bit of success doing this on lower level shield bases. However, I have found Reincarnation Embers to be fairly limited. The Ember of Truth re-rolls the modifier values on an item. Unlike other embers, this does not allow you to pick from two item states. Instead, it automatically applies the effect and forces you to keep it. However, it will keep all the mods on the item and just change the values within their ranges, so it's really hard to do permanent damage this way. Now that I've talked about all the ways in which you can craft items in Torchlight Infinite, I want to get into some advanced crafting tips which you can use when making endgame items. The first is something that I really can't stress enough. That is, only one modifier from a specific mod group can exist on an item at a given time. So if you have a weapon and you want to put added weapon physical damage as a prefix, you could use Essence Embers. But if you're going to be using a ruling ember later anyway, to roll the weapon physical damage and knockback chance, that modifier would always replace the Essence version, since they come from the same mod group. They're both gear added physical damage prefixes. But on the other hand, if you wanted to use a Tenacity Ember to roll fire resistance and cold resistance on an item, these suffixes are two different modifier groups, so both can exist on the same item. Pay attention to this, as it'll be especially important later. For the next tip, I know I've said it before, but I just want to stress again, that when you're going for a rare modifier like Fervor, make sure to do it at the earliest possible stage, and make sure you have materials for a lot of attempts, because it's not going to come within just a couple, and it could set you back hundreds if not thousands of materials. When crafting, it's important to always check the affixes and modifiers which can roll on your item using the ember you've selected, because there may be isolated cases where you want to craft on a base that's a lower level than 85. This would limit what the item can roll, potentially making it easier for you to get what you want. It may not be the thing to do when you're making your forever item, but it could be the thing to do when making an item that's good enough for now. An example of this would be that there's a lot of modifiers added at level 80. So if you craft on a level 79 base, you could roll a mod that requires level 75 while keeping the level 80 mods out of a pool. Having a smaller pool to work with means a higher chance of getting what you want. And now, let's do a live demo of some advanced crafting, making first a really good item, and then second, a forever item. And welcome to the crafting demonstration for the advanced crafting tips. I'm going to be making a 6-mod item with some legendary affixes from Ominous or Sleepless Embers, and I will be utilizing fossils. This is going to be a life-based, dex-based build. We're a crit build, and we're probably using projectiles since the theoretical character here is Carino. Again, this is to give you an idea of what crafting might actually look like, how much you'll spend, and how to go about it. To start with, I'm just going to spam these for life. I don't really want to waste fossils yet, when flame dust is really cheap, and overall something like a vigor ember won't be too expensive either. That's way too low. Again, you can always show tiers. I mean, restoring missing life on evasion's not bad, but way too low. All right, 105. This is going to be a forever item. If we were a minion build that scaled minion life, that would have been worth keeping. I'm going pretty quickly here. I advise not doing that. I advise going just a little bit slower than I am. You can accidentally roll over something that you would otherwise want. T3, I mean, it's a lot better. I'm going to be greedy though. I want tier 1 or tier 2. Remember, if I really wanted to guarantee tier 1, I could use the spiral fossil, I think that will be worth doing later, but at the early inexpensive stages, it can still be well worth it, especially if tier 2 is acceptable to you, to hold off on those and save them for when it's really gonna matter. Because trust me, later it can get way more expensive. T3 again. T2. All right. Gonna keep this. This is gonna be a good item. Next up, what do we want to add? I'm gonna assume that this item, you aren't as worried about basics. Sure, some resists might be nice. We're gonna use some of the juicy stuff though. Probably something like Fizz Taken converted to lightning. Probably something like maybe we're an unarmed build, or maybe we're just a projectile attack build. We definitely want to aim for enemies explode, or percent life, or active skill level. These are all good. The only problem is they replace a prefix, so we don't necessarily want 3 good prefixes. We'll just want 1 filler that we replace later. This is going to be where it's expensive. And again, really good options. All of these you'd probably be really happy with. But for now, let's try to put on some damage. Either some crit strike rating or some attack speed. And again, I'm not going to worry too much because we're only spending cheap stuff and we have decent odds of at least hitting tier 2. The nice thing here is there's 2 good outcomes, crit strike and attack speed. Which means a 50% chance to hit a usable mod group, and then roll something within that. That's really unfortunate. Projectile speed can be damage if you're in the marksman tree. You know what? There's a very good chance the theoretical projectile build would be in the marksman tree, so I think it's fair to keep that. And now we are on to Flame Dust, or Flame Sand. Remember, Flame Dust is 0 to 1, Flame Sand is 2 to 4. Right now, we have 2. Skill area could be good. I don't know what this theoretical build is though, so instead, I'm going to aim for some resistances. And still in the inexpensive part, especially if you don't need a specific resist, ideally, elemental res might be really nice. You'll also notice our prefix is getting taken off more. The more mods it has, the more likely that's going to keep happening. T3 fire res, not too bad. Again though, the goal is T1, T2. In a lot of these decisions, whether or not you use acute and spiral fossils, it's going to come down to prices. If your flame sand ends up being more expensive than the fossil, absolutely use it early on, especially if you're not super picky. I suspect the price is going to be high enough that the fossils could be 1 flame elementium each or more, so you're probably not going to be using them until fairly late into your crafting. This is unfortunate. We don't want to take off that life, even though tier 2 erosion res is very nice. Nope. T5, T7. Also, if you are ever crafting a more expensive item, try to make that one the item where your resistances are more flexible. If you're crafting a cheap item, that's where you fill in the resists and need a specific one, since everything else won't cost you nearly as much. Getting T3 a lot, but not quite what I want. You'll notice I've already used about 50. And that's at a single one per craft. This can get horrifyingly expensive if you are too rigorous in your requirements. Alright. Still nothing great. It really likes to take off that life right when I've rolled something nice. Here, 4 again. Here, 4, but takes off the life. T3 Corrosion. We've spent a bit. This might be a point where you compromise and you say, all right, I don't want to invest too much into this item. This is going to be really good. My erosion resistance will be capped regardless. I can get the rest somewhere else. And you take the piece. Now to use the Ruling Ember, we do need another prefix. The other prefix, remember, is a freebie. So is there any suffix that is super important? I really want a sleepless suffix and a ominous prefix on this item. But I don't actually care until then. These mods all have to be full. I want one prefix to be full with a specific ruling, which should be done when it has 4 mods on it. So I might as well use anything at all and just throw a single suffix on. So I don't care what, I just care that it is choosing to add a mod like that. The alternative, I'm going to throw this away now, demonstration. The alternative would be to roll something decent here using, say, a Soul Burst, because that way you can be a little more flexible. Maybe it takes the projectile speed, or it takes one of these. And because you're not being super picky, we've got anything but cast speed open on this, your odds are going to be a little bit better. Especially if at this point, you're willing to accept a T3 modifier, which I think is fair. If you look at the tiers here of, let's just say, the attack speed, 8 to 9, 10 to 12, 13 to 16, there's not a super huge difference there. This could be where fossils start becoming worth it, especially if you're trying to make a perfect item, what might be considered mirror tier in Path of Exile. If you want something solid, though, this looks really solid to me, especially since there's a decent chance it gets replaced. Now we have 4, we switch to Ruling. This is where it gets more expensive. It is now 6 per, and what do you want? Fizz taken converted to Lightning. There's a straight 25% chance, and about a 10% chance for tier 2. Once you roll that, 2.5% chance isn't necessarily great. However, extra Fizz taken works very similarly. That raises our odds, that basically doubles it. So now it's a 1 in 20. Recently hit, Minion Avoid, Not a fan of those, but there's 2 things on here that are pretty good. Let's take some gambles. Tier 5's a bit low. Tier 3. Remember how I said sometimes you can just have a filler mod? I think this is worth it, since it should be a lot cheaper to put back a filler mod here than to replace the quite good prefix. And there you go. Now, this is where it gets expensive. And so I'm going to use the first fossil here to put on a filler mod, because it's about a 40% chance. It's exactly a 40% chance to add a mod, and it costs 1 Flame Elementium. So if this is 2.5 Flame Elementium or more, it is not worth using. If it's, let's just say, 1 or 2, then it is worth using. I'm just going to put on a damage mod. If this gets replaced, it doesn't matter that it's minion damage. Now here's where the crafting gets really expensive. We're now going to spend 20 flame elementium each time. And we will get a very massive modifier. Sealed mana, but unfortunately it replaces life. Life, but it replaces life. I mean, that's something that you could honestly take. I think it's not worth it given the investment so far. Explode, again, you could take it. Really good, but I really want it to replace that minion damage. And there we go. It's replaced the minion damage. Replace the suffix. That is totally worth it. And here we have an Eternal Nightstalker's chest guard. But what if you have an unlimited budget and want to make something as expensive as possible? Well, again, I'd start very similarly where you don't need to use fossils for the first modifier that you craft. So we're just going to spam this. And we really want at least a T2 if you are going for all T1s. Actually, you know what? Let's pretend we're going for all tier 1s. You really want to be using these spiral fossils because it will greatly limit the outcomes. T1 immediately. T1 immediately. T1 Gear Energy Shield. There you go. Tier 1 Gear Energy Shield. We now have our ES. What's next? Well, if this is an unlimited budget item, the only other prefix can be ominous. 2 of the suffixes are going to be sleepless. So we're not going to worry about that. Who knows? Maybe we do some fizz taken as. I don't think you'd need it at that point. So I'm just going to throw a filler prefix on at a later stage. For now, let's start looking at suffixes. Again, probably going to have 1, if not 2 of these aura effect. Max res, all great. Spell crit rating. I mean, we're a shield build, so we're probably a spell build. Let's throw on some cast speed and see how it goes. Those spiral fossils will mean that, again, it's always high tier. You can get T2, and unfortunately attack speed's the only one that's not good for this build at all. Unfortunately, can't quite use that. There we go. So now everything else is just filler mods. All you need is the acute fossil and any ember that you want. I'm just going to do cultivation here. Oh, I forgot to click the fossil. That was on me. Do be sure when you switch them, you click the correct fossil. Otherwise, you can waste expensive embers and materials. There we go. Now prefix. Apply the fossil again. And this is where things are going to get staggeringly, eye-wateringly expensive. Because we want some minion damage replacement. There you go. That's how you replace it. Aura effect? Absolutely. Ideally spell crit, but I'd take max res. I just don't want the extra curse. It's unfortunate. Need to replace the all stats. You'll notice hundreds of flame elementium are just disappearing. This is super expensive endgame crafting. Do not aim for perfection. For point of comparison, the last craft that I demonstrated was infinitely cheaper than this. And all because, what did I forget? I'll give you a minute. The thing I forgot in this live demonstration is mod group. This can only have 1 mod, so now we need to replace this, and I should have crafted it the other way. I didn't actually do this intentionally, I genuinely did forget. However, it's a great learning moment, and I'm just going to throw a Tenacity Ember with Spiral Fossils. Normally, you would not do this. You would do it correctly. This is why I'm leaving this in the video, so you can learn from my mistakes. Watch your mod groups. Things of the same mod group cannot stack on the item. And there we go. A perfect 6 mod, super expensive item. The way you finish this is with a Truth Ember, because you want that Gear Energy Shield up. And you'll note you do not get a chance to either confirm or not. It just happens. So this could be what you're happy with, or you could go further. So whether you're a beginner looking to improve your gear, or an endgame grinder looking to min-max and make some forever items. Hopefully now you have a better idea of what to do and how to do it going forwards. If you have any other questions about crafting in Torchlight Infinite, or you just want to show off some epic items you've made, be sure to comment down below. I've been greatly enjoying the crafting experience in Torchlight, from the different methods introduced early on, to corroding legendary items and usually not getting what I want. Though trust me, when it hits, it is amazing. And there's something really satisfying about taking a 6 affix item and slamming on a legendary mod, and just watching your damage double or your enemies fall before you. If you need a build to play when starting your Torchlight journey, or you're just looking for something new, do be sure to check out my previous video on 3 starter builds I'd recommend. Another huge thanks to XD for sponsoring this video. If you haven't already tried it and want to check Torchlight Infinite out for yourself, maybe because you're intrigued by the crafting system, you can do so while supporting my channel using the link in the description below and the pinned comment. Personally, I always love it when games have comprehensive and in-depth crafting systems, and I look forward to seeing the other crafting methods added by future seasons. Remember, it can be easy to get a little too ambitious with your projects. A 6x tier 1 item will take a lot of time and a lot of investment. Luckily, you don't need perfect items to clear all the content. So it makes for a great goal to work towards when you're playing your forever build. Before getting into a crafting project, always check the market, because it might be cheaper to buy something rather than make it yourself. And again, always be aware of mod groups, as those can cause you to waste a massive amount of resources like you saw in the advanced crafting demo. And when you're in late endgame content, do keep an eye out for those rare bases, as they have things like % increased life, which will give your build a large boost. For now, good luck in your crafting, and when you make that item which doubles your DPS or otherwise just feels awesome, be sure to share your successes down in the comments below.